Off the Page. I have an American novelist here with me today, Howard Norman. He's written The Bird Artist, Northern Lights, and The Museum Guard. Welcome back to Halifax.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you here. Now, you live in Washington, D.C., but mostly in Vermont, yet these three novels that I've looked at are all set in Canada. One might wonder why. Are we really that exotic of a location?
Well, exoticness has nothing to do with it. It's the place I've traveled the most. On and off for 25, 30 years now. Been in and out of Canada, both in the Arctic and in the North, and in the Maritimes. But I think it's more the demographics of the imagination rather than citizenship.
Okay.
I write about Canada because it's the place I think most about, and the place I've heard the most stories about, and the place I am most sustained by thinking about. So in that way, I'm just like any other writer, trying to find a place that sustains the imagination the most.
Yeah, it's a comfortable geography for your imagination.
Yeah, and it's surprising, and every time I come, there's a new story to think about and a new thing to think about, and I certainly haven't exhausted by any means, at least from my point of view.
That's interesting. Any part of your American identity that's actually Canadian?
Well, I don't really feel that I have an identity that's, I think my identity is more connected to writing than it is to place.
Mm-hmm.
So I like living in Vermont. I'm close to Canada.
Yes.
I have the CBC on all day, but I still have a little bit of an objective perspective about it. So like a trip like this into Halifax, it's both a reunion and a kind of reconnaissance trip. I'm working on a new novel and setting it partly here.
Oh, okay.
So, you pick up things and you do a little research here and there.
Now, your three novels are also set in the past. Do you prefer to be working with some kind of temporal distance
Yes,
there?
very much.
Now,
very
why?
much.
Why?
I mean, I think at first it wasn't so conscious. I wasn't so aware of it. The Northern Lights is set in the late 1950s, and it's sort of the last time one could really claim a kind of innocence, because right after that, at least in the States, with the assassination of President Kennedy and so forth, and I wanted to have a little of that there, but it certainly, I was 10 years old in 1959. The Bird Artist is set in 1911 in Newfoundland, and that's because of a painting I saw that was done in 1911. So I started to think about that time period and read about that time period.
And the Museum Guard here, of course, is set in Halifax, and in Halifax in 1938 in particular.
Yes.
Why there, why then?
That was very specifically constructed, partly because I had two aunts and an uncle who, not being allowed into the United States, were allowed in through Canada. They were Eastern European Jews.
What do you mean when you say they weren't allowed into the United States?
Well, there's
Canada
restrictions on immigration,
Mm-hmm.
and those restrictions varied from year to year, and of course they were very restricted during the years immediately following the Second World War.
Was Canada more liberal in that regard?
Not necessarily more liberal,
Mm-hmm.
but the timing was better for them.
Right.
They actually tried to get into the Dutch West Indies as well, and they weren't allowed there. They traveled all the way back up to Halifax. It's quite a story, but not an unusual story. I mean, people went to tremendous lengths to try to get into either Canada or the United States. So the idea of a Jewish community, which is somewhat present in this novel, in Halifax has always intrigued me. But more, I think it's because Halifax is my favorite city. It just is. It's my favorite city, literally, to walk around in and to visit. But it's my favorite city in terms of literary imagination. And one of the reasons is because Halifax is, no matter how it's expanding and how it's growing, it still seems to me to be connected to the outports and connected to an older cadence, a kind of older cadence.
But it's changing quickly.
But it's changing
I
quickly.
wonder if you noticed even in the recent
I
trip.
have, and
Yeah.
it's quite shocking.
We're losing
when
it.
when you've been away for a while.
Right.
But when historically there's been violations of that calm, whether it's an explosion or unfortunately the most recent air tragedy, that sets up a contrast that's very interesting to me. So in the Museum Guard, you had Halifax in the late 1930s, and the war starting to, the horrors of the Second World War starting to ascend in the deep background of the book as it starts. And then news of what's going on in Hitler's Germany is imported into people's lives in Halifax. So without the calm place to begin with, the violation of that calm would have less dramatic presence to me as a writer. So that's really one of the reasons I said it here.
I'm wondering about that information that's first coming across the Atlantic in the late 30s into the 40s about what's happening to Jews in Germany. How did people in a place like Halifax begin to react to that? I suppose there was a lot of disbelief. Folks just saying, no, that can't possibly
There
be
was.
true.
There was. I think there was a lot of, nowadays would be called denial. I think there was a lot of convenient denial, which is people naturally absorb news in different ways. And I think while many people knew what Germany in terms of war machine was capable of already from the First World War, to really understand what was going on there took a long time. However, the Jewish community, and I talked to several people last night about this who were older men and women, because of having family connections in Europe, would hear things in a different way. They would hear things through family networks and through rumors which were then validated later on. So I would imagine, like most places, the Jewish community was able to ascertain the gravity of the circumstances,
Yes.
perhaps a little bit earlier, although who knows, it could have been the other way around in certain cases. Politically, what was acknowledged, of course, in America was acknowledged long after the fact. People, you know, president, vice president, most members of Congress were shown extraordinarily graphic pictures of concentration camps, but publicly would deny it was ever going on.
Do you react to that in any personal sort of way? Of course, this is historical, this is not today, but do you take that in a very personal sense?
Oh, of course. I mean, living in Washington once in a while, I've been in literary events and been in actual rooms with some of these very elder senators and congressmen. And I mean, I'm just human. I look at them in terms of events that one gets a purchase on in a more personal level. And I do look at them as people who were cowardly and who were reliant on the contingencies of political office rather than humanitarian concerns.
Yes.
Sure, but it's not an era I lived through, and
Right.
so it's more coming from relatives and older relatives.
Now, Halifax, as some of us know, is as good a place as any to be obsessed about something, and there are obsessions running through your novel here. Would you like to let us in on what they are?
Well, I think all the characters have a certain obsessive nature. The central, one of the protagonists is a woman named Imogen Linney, and she, in this book, is half Jewish. Her mother is Jewish, and she's the caretaker of a small Jewish cemetery. And when you meet her, she's on the verge of change. A reader nor Imogen knows exactly what that is going to be and what's going to be the catalyst for that. She's restless, she's cantankerous, she's highly wrought, dissatisfied. And a painting called Jewess on a Street in Amsterdam, which is a real painting, it's in Rotterdam now, arrives to a small museum. She sees the painting, and this is now what she obsesses about, and she constructs her entire existence around becoming the woman in the painting. So when you first meet her, she's on the verge of change, And then in the trajectory of the novel, you see her becoming the painting, entering the painting, as it were, and as everyone else is fleeing Amsterdam, she enters the maelstrom, goes right into Amsterdam. So there's that kind of obsessiveness. There's the obsessiveness of how to live a passionate life, I think, is throughout this book. I think authors are sometimes the last ones to be able to describe the themes and so forth in their book.
What about the history, too? What about the threads of history? Obviously, what's going on in Europe and Germany is happening at this time, but there's some other elements of the history of Halifax and of Jews in Europe in general.
Yeah, and the construction of this book is partly, is not arbitrary at all. At the beginning of the book, as I said previously, the war is in the deep background, but as paintings of Jewish themes arrive, and as Ovid Lamartine, a radio announcer, starts to announce what's going on in Europe, people are becoming more and more aware of things. And so what was in the deep background starts to become much closer to the foreground. And from talking to many, many people and from reading, one understands that that's really pretty much commensurate to what actually happened. Is you got an inkling of things going on, and the news would filter out, and pretty soon it's front page in the headlines.
Yes.
And so the book is constructed to in a sense, reiterate that process. So Halifax was getting all sorts of news. But of course, it wasn't until the Caribou Ferry was sunk and Canada actually entered the war that the whole news media, as it were, opened up, and then news of what was actually going on was in newspapers.
Makes us wonder, of course, about what are the stories that are around right now today that nobody is paying attention to, that 6 months from now or 1 year from now will be front page news, and we'll all wonder, well, how come we didn't know anything about that?
Yes, and you know, untold sufferings that are going on a very local level.
Yeah.
And it illustrates the power of the media, as well as just the redundancy of human behavior in and of itself. So I think, yes, I think this book does have an obsessive nature to it, and the characters are sometimes responding to things that they're not even sure what the sources are. And it's sort of about fates being tumbled forward in irreversible ways, I think.
Yeah, now, as a writer myself, like you, I become much more attracted to the eccentrics and people with various obsessions rather than the norm. What is it about writing and about fiction that makes obsessive characters or eccentrics so interesting and fun to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you bring up is really absolutely at the center of a writing life, is that, you know, writing by definition is antisocial. You are in a room for 5 or 6 hours, or however long one works a day. I think a lot of people become writers so that they don't have to interact necessarily in a conventional way with people. It certainly was true of me, and you develop a kind of intimacy with these characters that's in some senses deeper and more complicated than many people in your life.
Who's your favorite character that you have ever created? Your favorite eccentric character?
Well, I wouldn't, you know, and I think the point is that if you're living with them long enough, the eccentricity floats away, and everything is based on familiarity. And that's my goal, is to try to get to know these people well enough so that the eccentricities are less featured, and so a reader will think, well, it's easy to suspend disbelief because I've gotten to know the workings of this character's mind.
Does that suggest that deep down all of the most eccentric characters are actually quite normal?
I'm interested in showing in the course of a novel how something that was how a behavior or an aspect of personality that was fully resident in someone but hidden through circumstances becomes featured. And I think that's what happens in a lot of these characters, whether it's love or fear or whatever. And I find that's very true of people in general.
Are you a psychologist as a novelist then? Is that part of your job?
Well, I think you investigate certain psychological elements. But in all three of these novels, I've only written three, I've purposely tried to keep contemporary psychologizing out of the book. And whenever I've noticed even the slightest nuance of self-interpretation, I get it right out of there.
Right.
Because I want characters who aren't acting out of within a psychological paradigm, but within the way I've choreographed their lives with each other.
Stick to the fiction, because the fiction's
Yeah,
more
I mean,
honest
it's the
than
old show
the
don't
theories.
tell
Yeah.
kind of thing. And whenever I've felt any authorial, intervention, I've tried to
Cross those
to
lines
get it out.
Yeah.
And partly because I pare work down. I mean, I whittle it down like a Giacometti sculpture. I mean, I just whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle away. And so you have somewhat of a plot-driven book, but the plot, I hope, is more born out of character than imposed on the characters' lives.
Okay. And we're going to take a short break right now and be back with our guests right after this. Hi, welcome back to Off the Page. My guest today is Howard Norman. We're talking about his novels that are set in Canada. In the Museum Guard, of course, this painting is at the center of things. Are you very much influenced by visual art as a writer?
Well, I seem to be, since the first novel has someone who does some drawings, and The Bird Artist is very much about someone in 1911 who has a talent to draw birds, not many other talents, but that talent. And of course, the idea of museums, to me, which are very erotic places. I don't mean sexually so much as intellectually erotic. I mean, it's about...
Better define intellectually erotic for me.
I mean, it's about heightened emotion. I mean, I like to go to museums, and I like to talk to museum guards, and I like to think about what their mental lives are like. What are they thinking? They're around this art all day.
It's got to be a tough job. Any museum I've ever been in, I think this has got to be the world's worst, well, most difficult job.
You know, but when you talk to enough guards, and I've talked to guards in European cities and American cities and Canadian cities, it pretty much runs the gamut. Some, as you might guess, see it as a 9-to-5, almost a kind of aspect of law enforcement. And some are so utterly enamored and utterly absorbed in the work that they can barely pay attention to what they're supposed to be paying attention to.
Yes.
Many go to art classes, many are amateur artists, and then you find all sorts of things out, like the trading of rooms because certain guards can't bear to be in a room with certain... So I put some of that in this book. But intellectually erotic, I mean, if you're in New York, for instance, and people around the Metropolitan Museum who work in that area have 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 minutes for lunch, why do they rush into a museum and run right over to the Modigliani paintings or something? What is it about human nature that needs that kind of sustenance or that kind of hit? Some connection with some other element in the world. It intrigues me, and while I had characters in this book pontificating and dealing with disquisitions of various sorts, of very idiosyncratic natures about art, it is something I think about, and I'm very, very drawn to it. I can't draw at all. So there may be an element of vicariousness there.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I was in the Louvre in Paris last spring for the first time, and I kept going around touching all the statues. I didn't know why I was doing it, but I was doing it, and of course there was a guard there telling me not to do it.
Yeah.
How can you have all these statues of, made out of various forms of rock and just not want to touch
and not be
that
drawn
part of
to it? And I mean, they're textures, and so they're intellectual textures, they're emotional textures, and you see all sorts of behaviors in museums if you sit long enough.
Yeah.
You see flirtations, you see people who are clearly feeling that they've left their world momentarily. The last phrase in this novel, The Museum Guard, is "Don't get too close." A museum guard warns somebody, warns a former museum guard, "Don't get too close." And of course, that is more of a metaphorical warning as well as a literal one. I mean, you don't want somebody touching paintings. But if you start to get too close to the life of this painting, what life is depicted, you lose yourself in it. And in the case of Imogen, she lost herself in it so much that she never really returned.
What about your readers now? You're talking about how art affects you, or art has an effect on other people around you. What's the effect that you want your novel to have on the reader? Is the reader supposed to come that close and not touch it as well?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that's a provocative question, because I don't think you have to approach it from many, many angles. I think, first of all, you know, as you know, if you write to please, it's probably the death of the spirit. You can't determine an audience. All I think a writer can do is have a very high level of regard for his or her readers. And past that, there's not one thing I would hope, except that a reader might, if you're lucky, determine that you wrote at the top of your capacity to write.
Yes.
Just the art part of it, the aesthetic part of it. The believability, the suspension of disbelief, the question, could this have really happened, have no meaning to me at all. I think that's totally up to a reader. I would never worry about that, because then I think preemptively you mitigate certain directions you want to try to explore as a writer.
Yes. Now, you didn't publish your first novel until you were 40. Do I have that right?
I was 38.
38, okay,
Yeah.
getting close.
Yeah.
That sounds late in a writer's career in some sense.
Well, that's a curious thing. I mean, you come to it when you come to it. I was writing since I was, 19 for a living, but not fiction. And I'd always wanted to write fiction. But if you study the lives of writers, if you study the history of writing, the history of literature, 38 historically is not young.
Yes.
People wrote in their 40s and 50s at the, wonderful books.
Did you throw out a couple of novels first?
No, I did not. I threw out a lot of stories.
Yes.
And getting together an archive lately, I was shocked at how many, terrible, embarrassing stories there were.
Oh, I think you have to write garbage before you write something good, don't you?
You write garbage. I write garbage while I'm writing the stuff I keep. I mean, this book, I probably, I'm a very slow writer. This book probably, I threw out 1,000 pages of writing.
Wow.
To keep it.
Now,
So-
why would you do that? A person who might think of the writing occupation as something that you labor over all these words, obviously, and you want to keep as many of them
Yeah.
as you can. It's more efficient
Yeah.
to keep them all, but you don't.
Well, I don't know that I think, again, I think it's individual writers say individual things. For me, writing a novel starts out with the most severe sort of self-deprecation. I mean, I get an idea, and then I start to argue against it. I mean, absolutely, with tremendous persistence.
It sounds like a battle.
For me it is, not melodramatic one, it's just a personal one. Oh, that sounds too cinematic. Oh, that sounds too much like a concept, so forth. And those ideas that more or less haunt one is what I keep. I think it's why I've only written 3 novels.
Yes.
And then I write a biography of each of the characters, from birth till death, in a separate notebook. And I get a couple of things from there that I'll keep in the book. So the approach to the beginning of writing for me is a couple years.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's just absolutely, it's unfortunate in a lot of ways, because I can't seem to approach it in any other way.
It's a long apprenticeship to each novel.
Just to get to the starting of it.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to take another short break, and we'll be back right after this. You've been watching Off the Page today. My guest has been Howard Norman, and I thank you again for watching Off the Page. I hope you'll watch again next time.